Austria is a small country located in the center of Europe and has a population of nearly 9 million inhabitants. Our country is highly affected by climate change, as the increase in the annual average temperature is about 2 degrees Celsius compared to the levels of 1880. In comparison, the global average increase is about 1 degree. Along the west-east gradient of Austria, the landscape differs, and so do the consequences of climate change. While in mountainous areas in the western part of the country, we can observe glaciers melting, less snow, and a higher risk of natural disasters, the eastern part, where also Vienna locates, suffers mainly from droughts and heat waves. Young people in Austria have been actively calling for climate justice for many years, and we also have a significant history of young people who have been standing up for nature conservation. In recent years, the local Conference of Youth and Fridays for Future became key motivators for networking activities, empowerment opportunities, and for young people to connect and stand up together to demand more climate ambition from national and international politicians. During the third local conference of youth in October 2020, participants formulated demands to Austrian leaders, which can be summarized in 4 most important fields. First of all, we need fair carbon pricing throughout the economy, ensuring to leave no one behind. Secondly, communication is key. We need to save our homes. Framing it to the positive and highlighting the opportunities are crucial. And last but not least, the judicial part, ensuring all current and new legislation should be in line with climate targets. Overall, climate activists want to see learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic. In Austria, a lot of money was made available fast to save the economy after the first lockdown. And young people want to see the same resources being made available for fighting climate change. Treat every crisis like a crisis. Additionally, we demand all subsidies and fundings aiming to boost the economy only to be given to climate-friendly projects. The European Youth calls for climate objectives that are in line with science and the Paris Agreement. This means cutting the greenhouse gases by 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires adoption of consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and an effective implementation of the Green Deal. My name is Katja, and together with Ines and Antoine, I am looking forward to representing Austria at the mock COP26 and raising Austria's ambition in contrast to the political action our country takes at actual COP. We are not only urging for action to be taken in real life, but we deserve it.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of mock COP26. I speak to you today representing the youth of Belarus, a country in Eastern Europe with a population of 10 million people. Here in Belarus, we are very privileged to not witness the worst effects of climate crisis yet, but we can see the agroclimatic zones are shifting due to global warming. In summer, there are more heat waves and droughts. There is still a lack of green spaces, that's not to mention the negative impact of urban growth on habitats and biodiversity. There are some projects that implement activities in order to initiate the stakeholders' engagement in the development of climate agenda. For example, Terrifica project in Belarus is focused on data collection, mapping stakeholders, testing crowd mapping tool, and development of behavior change methodologies based on best practices and tools in climate mitigation and adaptation. Our young people took part in online activities within the Fridays for Future. In Belarus, we don't have possibility to organize strikes. Freedom of speech was and is being violated. We do not have access to information. After presidential elections this summer, young people are under intense pressure. From August to November 2020, a number of environmental activists and journalists were detained. We are organizing climate conferences and interactive lessons to make more people aware of climate crisis. We are asking the government to make climate education mandatory for all elementary and secondary school students and implement into the curriculum the science on climate crisis. Climate-related programs, strategies have been adopted in Belarus to improve the environmental situation. In September 2016, the country ratified the Paris Agreement. But all efforts for joint work of civil society and the authorities have been cancelled out by the political crisis after presidential election 2020. Belarus can and should take various economic and institutional measures in the fight against climate change to create a system of trading in greenhouse gas emissions. In the field of adaptation to changes, it is necessary to create a national adaptation fund, insurance against the risk of extreme events, to develop adaptation strategies by economic sector. We, young people, cannot continue working in safety on climate crisis in view of an ongoing political one. We call on the authorities to stop the violence, violation of civil and political rights, and start working on climate crisis. Thanks.
Distinguished delegates and observers of COP26. Belgium is a small and densely populated country at the very heart of the European Union. It has a complex federal structure. More than 11 million inhabitants enjoy a very high standard of living according to the Belgian Human Development Index. But this lifestyle goes with an alarmingly high carbon footprint. If everyone lived like Belgian people do, we would need 4.3 planets.
So far, we have been climate laggards, slow in organizing our energy transition and always settling for the least common denominator. Reflecting on our assets on the one hand and on our historical emissions of greenhouse gases on the other hand, the Belgian youth recognizes that the Belgian nation has to take its responsibility to build a desirable future.
Firstly, we call on our governments to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We need to invest domestically in a recovery plan that massively supports, among other things, green jobs, renewable energy, building renovation, soft mobility and ecosystem restoration. Belgium should also invest abroad. To actually respect the engagement made during COP15 towards developing nations, Belgium should increase its climate finance budget to 500 million euros each year.
Secondly, the youth demands that Belgian authorities listen to the science in their attempt to limit the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. As part of the European youth, we call for climate objectives that are aligned with science and with the Paris Agreement. This means cutting the EU greenhouse gases emissions by at least 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires the adoption of consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and the effective implementation of the Green Deal. Belgium must support policies that integrate climate matters in agriculture and commercial agreements.
Finally, Belgium should reform its climate governance. The current structure has hindered our ambition and coherence. Belgian policymakers urgently have to set their internal decisions aside and act upon our national motto: unity makes strength. We must do our utmost best to work as one, in solidarity, as we cannot afford to let the least ambitious of us set the pace.
To conclude, the Belgian youth demands climate ambition and policy coherence. In addition, the Belgian youth demands solidarity. Solidarity between Wallonia and Flanders, between the rich and the poor, between the global north and the global south, and between the elders and the future generations. Thank you.
Dear distinguished delegates and observers of mock COP26, we speak to you today representing the youth of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country in the Eastern Europe with a population of 3.5 million people. Although we hadn't yet experienced the effect of the climate crisis in magnitude some other nations in the world had, we still experienced great air pollution.
Unfortunately, there hadn't been great Fridays for Future youth turnout all around the country, and it might be due to the lack of climate education in schools. House of Representatives of the Parliament of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, comprising 51% of the country, has just this June moved to ban all construction of small hydropower plants. However, the end of desecration of our rivers and attack on lives of people living near rivers has been just one of the many problems people in our country face, environmentally wise. Adequate dispensation of pharmaceutical and medical waste, adequate regulation and punishment for exploitators of protected natural resources, ban of construction of small hydropower plants in Brčko district and Republic of Srpska, and most importantly, stoppage of further deterioration and reduction of carbon dioxide emissions are all necessary actions government of Bosnia and Herzegovina should take before it's too late. As youth from Bosnia and Herzegovina, we demand that our government works closely and aligns its strategies and work in field with other nations and provides whatever support it can for the nations that struggle themselves. Our government should introduce more environmentally related subjects in schools, starting from young age all the way to university.
We believe it is high time we tackle this problem with decisiveness through the firm leadership of the figures that understand that our future is at stake. As youth, we hope our government will involve us in the decision-making and will take the responsibility for the lives of 3.5 million people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of COP26. We speak to you representing the youth of Bulgaria, a nation in southeastern Europe with a population of 7 million people, member state of the European Union. In a few days, in connection with climate banners, we'll call our Prime Minister to support a target of at least 65% reductions of the greenhouse gas emissions during the European Council in December as the new EU NDC. Bulgaria has not yet suffered much due to climate change, but it's the young people who will face the negative impacts strongly. The vulnerabilities coming from the already rising temperatures consist of increased risks of drought, fires, floods, frequent and longer heat waves and cold waves. The young people of Bulgaria are becoming more and more aware of the need to act on climate. The local branches of Fridays for Future have contributed to the largest climate protest in Sofia in September 2019, with climate actions happening in several cities. As a means to combat the climate crisis, Bulgaria should implement sooner the European Green Deal. The money for recovery from the coronavirus pandemic must be used so that we build our economies in a just and green way.
Carbon neutrality could be achieved through government-implemented policies such as stopping support for fossil fuels, a swift transition to renewable energy and circular economy, while putting an end to the destruction of Bulgaria's rich biodiversity. Neither are also local-level decisions encouraging agroecology and local eco-friendly production, clean public transport, renovation of the railways, and more pedestrian green zones. Furthermore, we ask our government to implement climate education into the curriculum for all level education institutions. The power of education is vital in creating a more just, democratic society and a sustainable future where all of us and our country's future generations could thrive. As youth from Bulgaria, we see and care about the consequences of climate change that are already taking many lives and homes around the world. As a developed country, it is our responsibility to help those affected most and to take more action than those with less resources. Realistic and science-based measures have been proposed, and we demand that the government takes immediate action for the better of the people in our country and in all other countries who are suffering and will continue to suffer because of climate inaction. We believe our government will finally begin accepting this responsibility and doing its fair share to deal with the climate crisis.
We are the MOC COP26 delegates for Greenland,
the Faroe Islands,
and Denmark. In Denmark, our global north lifestyle and high consumption generate a very high ecological footprint, whilst relying on the exploitation of nature and of poorer regions of the world.
The Faroe Islands are on the same exact track for the same reason.
As a tiny portion of the world's population and contribution to climate change, Greenland is still tremendously impacted, with critical polar ice and sea level issues which endanger the livelihoods of indigenous populations.
In Denmark, the current climate's ambitions rely on a hypothetical future development of CO2 absorbing technologies. This absolutely does not address the roots of the crisis we face.
In the Faroe Islands, the government is nowhere near on track with its unambitious climate targets and legislations, especially when it comes to the fishing industry.
Given the tremendous potential of the landscape of Greenland and the Faroe Islands for renewable energy, there are opportunities that are not being harnessed.
Activists across all three countries have been pushing for years for policies and changes that are way more ambitious than the governments have been willing to even consider. We need this to change.
There are solutions, disrupting ones, but they carry with them the level of change that we need to see for climate justice and healthy, resilient livelihoods to thrive. Hence, we bring the following proposals to the table.
Firstly, we need our countries to transparently reveal to the public to the extent of the emergency, and to democratically, with the youth and minorities, design an agenda to mitigate and adapt to the crisis that puts our lives at risk.
Secondly, we acknowledge that the current policies in place reinforce a capitalist logic which will not ever release the pressure on nature and marginalized populations. We also acknowledge that the current responsibilization of consumers through a market approach is not an appropriate solution. We need to think bigger.
Which brings us to a third demand. We need to rethink our economic institutions. Denmark is rich enough and developed enough. We are in a position to stop looking at and look at the resilience and well-being of our communities instead, in order to reduce the inequalities that persist both within our country and the ones we created through centuries of negative externalities imposed on the global south. Our position gives us the responsibility to act decisively while it's still possible.
Finally, beyond climate neutrality, we request our countries to reach climate positivity by 2035, as a recognition that we develop on the back of the global south and that they now need the emission space to develop and build the infrastructure to reach similar levels of development.
These demands need to be aligned with our society by integrating them both within our legislations and our educational systems.
Honorable delegates and observers of MOC COP26, we represent Finland, a Nordic country which is among the 10 highest greenhouse gas emitters per capita in Europe.
Because of its northern location, Finland has already seen a rise in average temperature of around twice the global average. This warming in the north is causing the melting of permafrost and methane release, which is accelerating climate change. Especially in the global south, the climate crisis will have catastrophic impacts. As a developed welfare state, we want to see Finland taking more responsibility in supporting our brothers and sisters in the global south.
Finland must also take a leading role in climate change mitigation through national action. The Finnish government is currently rewriting our climate law. We demand our government to make the Finnish carbon neutrality target of 2035 legally binding and to give youth a bigger role in decision-making related to our future. Finland must stop unsustainably managing its forests and ensure that carbon sinks will be harnessed to their full potential. Finland is also burning the biggest amount of peat globally. We demand our government to set an end date to peat usage, just as on other fossil fuels. Finland should change agricultural subsidies to promote carbon sequestration and biodiversity protection. As a EU member state, Finland should promote more effective carbon trading
taxation for aviation fuels, and the enhancement of corporate responsibility on a European level.
The European youth call for climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. This means cutting our carbon emissions by 65% by 2030. To reach this target, we require coherent and consistent policies across all sectors and effective implementation of the Green Deal. We are extremely proud of all the climate activists in Finland who are dedicating their time to combating the global crisis. We would like to call all climate activists to embrace Christiana Figueres' idea of stubborn optimism. We believe in a better world, and we will stop at nothing. Finally, to all world leaders listening, the time for asking youth to solve the climate crisis is over.
We have voiced our concern. Now it's your time to take responsibility and act.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, la France, forte d'une grande biodiversité du fait de sa métropole et de ses territoires d'outre-mer, est vulnérable au changement climatique. En tant que pays hôte de l'accord historique de Paris, la France doit prendre ses responsabilités et protéger davantage à la fois ses territoires et ses habitants. Notre pays est aujourd'hui responsable d'1% des émissions mondiales de gaz à effet de serre et les conséquences du changement climatique touchent désormais notre quotidien. Pensons aux vagues de chaleur de plus en plus intenses, aux sécheresses et aux inondations de plus en plus fréquentes, à la déforestation en Guyane française par exemple, ou encore aux migrations climatiques. Nous notons également que la pollution de l'air cause la mort de près de 48 000 citoyens chaque année en France. Si ce constat est préoccupant, la jeunesse française apparaît tout de même extrêmement mobilisée, au travers par exemple de marches pour le climat ou d'actions de sensibilisation et de solutions pratiques pour améliorer notre vie quotidienne et notre avenir. Aujourd'hui, c'est bien 99% des étudiants français qui se disent conscients du problème posé par le changement climatique, et en témoigne l'augmentation des associations d'étudiants dans ce secteur. Aussi, nous nous accordons avec la jeunesse européenne pour réclamer des politiques communes ambitieuses qui soient alignées avec les objectifs de l'accord de Paris. Tout d'abord, réduire nos émissions de gaz à effet de serre d'au moins 65% en 2030 à l'échelle de l'Union européenne, et ce, par la mise en œuvre du Green Deal. Il faudrait également réviser la nouvelle PAC pour qu'elle soit compatible avec de nouvelles stratégies. En effet, la PAC correspond à environ un tiers du budget de l'Union européenne, alors que ce secteur contribue à près de 10% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de l'Union européenne. De plus, au niveau national maintenant, nous demandons que la France tienne ses objectifs en matière de réduction d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Notons qu'elle les a dépassés de près de 4% durant la période 2015-2019. Il faut absolument cesser de repousser les échéances établies par la SNBC en 2015 en réduisant les objectifs à court terme tout en les rehaussant à long terme, et prendre en compte les émissions importées dans notre action diplomatique. Par ailleurs, nous souhaiterions que l'intégralité des jeunes élèves et étudiants, ainsi que les professeurs, soient formés aux enjeux du réchauffement climatique, de la biodiversité, du développement durable et de la justice climatique. Malgré une première intégration de ces enjeux dans les enseignements du secondaire, son apprentissage demeure facultatif et très largement superficiel dans le supérieur. Une étude récente va dans ce sens et montre que 65% des étudiants estiment que tous les cursus doivent intégrer ces enjeux. Enfin, il nous semble important d'améliorer nos capacités d'adaptation en intégrant l'ensemble des acteurs concernés, élus, entreprises, agriculteurs et citoyens. Nous ambitionnons de rendre nos villes plus résilientes, de freiner l'artificialisation des sols et de modifier l'agriculture en favorisant la diversification des cultures ou encore des pratiques d'agroécologie et d'agroforesterie. Merci.
This is the high-level statement from Germany. We are honored to be part of more COP26, and we want to show the world's leaders how the youth would face the climate crisis. Because one thing is certain, we are in the middle of the climate crisis and we have to act now. The world cannot wait until we are in positions of power. During the corona pandemic, we suddenly noted that our German government is perfectly capable of treating a crisis as such. We need the same focus when it comes to the climate. Only because of a pandemic, Germany was able to meet the climate goals for 2020 that the government has set. This is not the way it should be. People are suffering from the corona crisis, and the virus itself was able to develop because humans don't care about our planet. This should be an eye-opener to us, as the climate crisis is linked to many other social and economic crises. Germany currently holds the presidency of the EU Council. That's a perfect position to initiate change. The European Youth calls for climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. That is, cutting our greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030. This ambitious target requires to adopt consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and to effectively implement the Green Deal.
Germany, being part of the global north, is facing a massive responsibility. And so we and millions of young people in Germany demand actions such as the national emissions stop rising and finally drop. These actions must include a coal exit in 2030, the latest, and an immediate stop of cutting trees in unreal hours for the construction of our new highway. But that's only the start. We seek for an ecological transformation. The climate crisis already is affecting even Germany, not only economically. We experience more heat waves in the summers that present a risk for the weak and to our food supply system, and a massive extinction of fowls and species. But Germany is affected way less than other countries. There are already climate refugees who search for a safe home. We demand actions of solidarity with all refugees around the world, and especially in the global south. People are suffering. People are dying due to the climate crisis, a crisis for which we as Germans and our lifestyle are co-responsible. Therefore, we demand leaders of the global north to listen to the people of the global south and to be aware of their responsibility, to be aware of the failure to create climate justice. Not yet. There is no time for excuses anymore. It's time to get to work.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of the mock COP26. My name is Dimitris Vavourakis and I'm representing the youth of Greece, a Mediterranean country located in the southwestern Europe with a population of 11 million people. In Greece, we are already facing, unfortunately, the effects of climate change. Increased global temperatures cause long dry periods in the summer, followed by extreme and more frequent heat waves and deadly wildfires, destroying forests, infrastructures, and entire ecosystems. We are also confronting with an increasing rate over the last years, and especially during the cold months, severe thunderstorms and rainfalls that deposit huge amounts of water, causing floods and having multiple impacts in agriculture and stock farming. Aquaculture and sea ecosystems are also affected by the increasing sea temperatures, with the hot waters attracting species that used to live in hotter waters than Mediterraneans and threatening the local species with extinction. Unfortunately, these are only some of the direct ramifications that climate change and global warming have already brought to Greece, and for time reasons I will not be able to refer some of the indirect ramifications in my 3-minute statement, but I will be very glad to discuss them in person. What should we do? What should our government do? Our government should take immediate action in order to restrain those consequences. Improve the target of being carbon neutral is one of those actions. Specifically, our country's target is to achieve a reduction of 56% in greenhouse gases by 2030, in contrast with 2005. It is already a goal difficult to achieve, at least with the existing power production. Over the last year, there has been a lot of progress and effort in Greece in trying to replace natural gas and lignite with renewable energy sources such as sun and wind as main power sources. The state should put a lot more effort though in that direction, making it easier and economically convenient for citizens and companies to invest in such infrastructures without destroying the natural beauty of the landscapes. At the same time, promoting the usage of electric vehicles by legislating that way and giving advantages to the users of those vehicles can be an important factor of reducing the CO2 emissions. It is really important to introduce climate education in all school grades, providing students with a scientific background about climate change and enabling them to organize actions in a local level. And last but not least, the Greek government should take into account climate change in each and every future plan about city designs and infrastructures. promote the construction of buildings that are energy self-sufficient, and exploit the Green New Deal to the optimal level. As a delegate that represents the youth of Greece, a country that already suffers from climate change in many ways, as I have already mentioned, I strongly believe that there shouldn't be any more time lost, and government should take into serious consideration our scientifically based proposal and act immediately. Thank you.
Hello to all the delegates and the observers of COP26. I'm here today representing the youth of Hungary, a small country in Eastern Europe with a population of 9.7 million people. Here in Hungary, we can already see some of the effects of the climate and ecological crisis, that being extreme weather patterns. However, we recognize how privileged we are to be able to live in such a place. We see the suffering of peoples in other nations who are more severely affected, and we also know how we contributed to the global temperature rise. The youth of Hungary have been organizing protests and other events to demand change from our leaders. Around 10,000 people took part in climate strikes around the country in September 2019, but we haven't stopped and we never will. The European youth calls for climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. This means cutting the EU greenhouse gas emissions by at least 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires the adoption of consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and an effective implementation of the Green Deal. In Hungary, our emissions have been decreasing, and we are close to reaching the current goal of cutting 40% of our emissions in comparison to 1990. We demand that the Hungarian government be ambitious with their climate policies and not refrain from setting higher targets. The current government solution is to use nuclear energy instead of burning fossil fuels. We already get 49% of our energy from nuclears, while only 12% from renewable resources. The 2030 target to get to 21 from 12% is a joke. Instead of investing in nuclear energy, we want the government to shift their entire scope to renewable energy. As the youth of Hungary, we see the consequences of the crises we are experiencing around the world and in our homes. We have a responsibility to help those affected the most by reducing our emissions and helping other nations. The government declared a climate emergency in our capital, but they need to declare one across the whole country. Stop throwing around empty words. In conclusion, the youth of Hungary demands the government to invest in renewable energy and start taking action. Listen to the science and do our fair share of keeping the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Stop ignoring the facts and the voices of the youth. Treat this crisis like a crisis. Thank you.
Dear delegates, dear world, we are honored to get this opportunity to represent Iceland at COP26. Iceland is a small island nation of about 360,000 people. But despite our size, we are in a great position to act as an example. Like every single nation on Earth, we stand to lose a lot from this crisis. Last year, we mourned the loss of the very first glacier, Bokjökull. Our glaciers are going to continue to melt. The acidification of the ocean is going to threaten our livelihood, and our reliance on imported food is going to become a very real problem if we don't act fast. There is a climate action plan. It is in accord with international agreements, but it is not enough. Iceland's current climate action plan aims to reduce ESR emissions by 39% compared to the year 2005 by the year 2030. Land use and ETS emissions are, unfortunately, not included in this number. With those taken into account, Iceland is only really aiming for a 9% reduction in emission in these categories, which we think is completely unacceptable.
The government is already falling behind on their plan only 5 months after its publication. The Icelandic emission per capita is 44 tons a year if land use and ETS are included. This is one of the highest rates of emissions in the world, and worryingly it does not include the emissions related to the consumption of products produced in other nations. The Icelandic government has allocated about 0.2% of its total annual income for 2020 to climate mitigation efforts. It's not enough according to a scenario made by the OECD. We should expand our plans to use a minimum of 4% of our GDP for actions to mitigate climate change. We should also give way more to other nations in the global south that are in more need and can leverage the money better in order to slow down emissions. We should aim to reduce our emissions by at least 50%, including ETS and land use, in the next 10 years. Iceland aims to become carbon neutral by 2040. That means that all of the reduction we are not able to achieve in the next 10 years will have to be achieved between 2030 and 2040. It is unjust to put the majority of the burden on the next generation, and it's also not in line with the urgency of the matter. The Icelandic Youth Environmentalist Association has put together public comments regarding this issue along with national student organizations. We are experiencing this global momentum amongst our local youth. Thanks to our easy access to politicians, we have also been meeting politicians to talk about climate change. We feel only partly listened to. We are praised for enthusiasm, but politicians are not taking us seriously enough. They are not treating this crisis like a crisis.
We, the delegation of Ireland, understand that we have neglected to educate the citizens of our country in the climate crisis, as well as neglecting to provide adequate funding to the development of a sustainability subject at second level, despite appeals from students, teachers and delegates of the RTE Youth Assembly. We pledge that within the next 5 years, we will integrate the climate crisis into every existing subject, as well as fascinating and funding the creation of a compulsory second-level subject using a combination of student voice, as well as teachers and experts on the climate crisis. We understand that Ireland allows the occurrence of ecocide to go unchecked. We are losing the unique flora and fauna that reside in their indigenous habitats by replacing forested areas with harmful Sitka spruce plantations that are only in existence for monetary purposes. We pledge to support our citizens' health by upping our goal of reforestation from 17% to 25%, as well as ensuring that we bring back the habitats that have been systematically destroyed over the decades. As well as that, we pledge to ensure that by 2025, every council house will have access to renewable energy, whether it is a local wind farm or solar panels, depending on situation, as well as making planning permission for renewable energy sources much easier, as well as stopping the importation of fracked gas. By providing a ratio of funding of 2:1 to public transport and the construction of roads, we will be able to implement strong and lasting structures to ensure that our emissions fall rapidly. As well as that, we pledge to take account not just for the emissions created by the state, but also for the emissions that are the responsibility of the state, i.e. GHG from shipping, aviation, etc. The European Youth calls for climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. This means cutting the EU GHG emissions by at least 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires the adoption of consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and an effective implementation of the Green New Deal.
We understand that our lack of regard for climate justice as a nation leads to harmful misconceptions surrounding the climate crisis. We recognise that Ireland's homeless have not been accounted for in our climate bill. We understand that the term is used once in the climate bill, and the dismissal of the need for a focus on it in all aspects of climate action is unproductive. We also recognise that the lack of focus on international approach to climate action, including accommodations for most affected areas and places, is ineffective and overly short-term focused. We pledge to increase the focus on climate justice through increased funding in eco-friendly housing for the homeless in Ireland. We also pledge to liaise on an international level with EU and UN member states to accommodate MAPA. We recognise that Ireland's lack of infrastructure against flooding has serious impacts on families yearly. We recognise that this impact only grows as the climate crisis worsens. We pledge to increase funding in flood-resistant infrastructure in these areas. We pledged to retroactively add flood-resistant technology to houses in these areas, while also ensuring that new houses built in these areas are fitted with the facilities needed.
Fellow delegates and observants of COP26.
We speak to you today representing the youth of Italy, a peninsular country located in the central part of Europe that counts more than 60 million people.
The situation in Italy is anything but acceptable at the moment. We have always perceived this crisis as distant, mainly because we never felt its effect as much as we are right now. The Italian population in the last year has been experiencing some of the direst consequences of the climate crisis. Events such as flood and droughts have been increasing in frequency and seriousness in the last 2 decades, and this trend is far from being stopped.
People are losing their jobs, their homes, their lives due to the fact that we're not facing this crisis correctly and we're not willing to realise this. The Italian government has been showing its lack of will to address the climate crisis by carrying on financing corporations such as Eni that benefit from the destruction of our environment with the same money that is supposed to be invested in a transition towards a zero carbon economy.
We are failing, and this is clearly shown by the melting glaciers in our Alps that today are just 1/3 of what they used to be 40 years ago, by our insane increase in temperature, which is inevitably affecting our country's agricultural production.
By the countless studies that are stating that if our and other countries go on behaving in this way, the human race is going to become extinct among the thousands of others in no time.
We are failing, but this remains unspoken from the media.
On the other hand, young people in Italy do not accept this under-evaluation of the situation and have been mobilising for years, organising and taking part in strikes, attending meetings with the highest rank of politicians, creating a detailed and comprehensive plan to outline how the transition towards a sustainable Italy must be achieved, always bringing forth the need for a binding plan to protect present and future generations and to ensure them a livable future. Young people are mobilising and they will not resign.
It is no doubt that in order for Italy to start moving forward in facing this climate crisis in the best, most efficient and in fact only feasible way, it is fundamental to acknowledge the severity of this crisis and act accordingly. That is why the youth of our country calls for the government to provide and agree on the policies that will keep Italy in line with the Paris Agreement by utilising the technologies that are already accessible to rethink and reshape the way our country lives and develops. To reach zero net emission by 2030, as largely defined in the written plan by the Italian youth itself, Ritorno al futuro.
In conclusion, it is clear that the Italian government is not doing enough. That even though we've implemented mandatory environmental education in school programs, this doesn't mean we're doing whatever is needed. And indeed, it is completely the opposite. In contrast, we do know that if our leaders wanted to do something, we would be able to change for the better. Therefore, the Italian youth puts its hopes in the fact that COP26 will contribute to political action and will make Italy, among other countries, take that step further in order to achieve a change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, dear delegates and observers of COP26. My name is Sofia and I will be representing the youth of Latvia. It is a small country located in Northern Europe, and we are a part of European Union and Baltic states, of population of 1.9 million people. Latvia is a country privileged enough not to experience drastic effects of climate crisis. More than half of our land is covered in forests, and agriculture and manufacturing is not developed that much, so it could affect carbon emissions significant amount. Cities are full of greens and parks, and government of Riga, the capital of Latvia, is improving bicycle-friendly roads, so traveling by bike is more available. But in agriculture, we use many chemicals that affect our health by consuming products, and chemicals affect the health of animals and insects. And for a small country, chemical pollution is a big issue. That is why the youth of Latvia is participating in Fridays for Future. We want more changes in local politics. The last Fridays for Future strike took place on September 25th. We demanded clear air without pollution caused by agriculture and carbon dioxide emissions produced by transport, because in Latvia, transport is one of the biggest carbon dioxide producers. I want Latvian leaders to finally listen to demands of society. If people will be motivated by law, government needs to support climate activism by making climate-neutral life a demand from everybody. Needs to be supported eco-friendly manufacturers, law needs to change society's actions. For example, if taxes for fossil fuel cars would be higher, people still could not buy electrical cars. They will just pay higher taxes and have even less money. So at this point, new laws will not help. But government can motivate mechanical industry so environment-friendly lifestyle can be affordable. So in conclusion, I think there's no problem in people not being interested in climate change. It is the way that people cannot change their lifestyle, and government is not interested in making that change. So the only thing that government can do is to motivate development and improve economy, so people can voluntarily and mandatorily help the climate crisis.
Distinguished guests, mock-up organizers and viewers. Once known as the greenest corner of the southeastern Europe, Republic of Moldova is today hamstrung by both the impact of the climate crisis and a disregard for a coherent cross-institutional climate policy making by the authorities throughout the years of independence. Just this year, we have gone through the worst drought of the 21st century so far, all while our river basins and green spaces keep being decimated. Ministry of Environment doesn't even exist as a separate entity since 2018, merged with the Agriculture Ministry. Moldovan youth is taking a strong stance in the fight for a nature-positive homeland. Through protests, grassroots initiatives in adaptation and action through climate empowerment, and regional coalition building, our activists make their voices heard, including to the diplomats accredited in Moldova. It is no coincidence that it was the European Union who provided enormous help to our country in updating its NDC and submitting it in March 2020, after the most intense period in the history of Moldovan youth climate activism. While it demonstrates an increased ambition, like 88% GHG emissions reduction by 2030 from 1990, conditional on the financing available, and better defined finance needs for areas such as adaptation and mitigation, many aspects are still left behind. As youth, we can't accept the fact that action for climate empowerment pillar, including the gender aspect of it, isn't strong enough to recognize the importance of mass climate education in Moldova, particularly in the school curricula. When EU member countries are rapidly moving in this direction, it is imperative for us as a signatory country of the association agreement with the EU to not let our and forthcoming generations to be left behind in their knowledge and ability to act on this issue. Climate education and education for green jobs should be a bedrock of new education reform that would be able to link the need to enhance natural, human and physical capital altogether, providing better environment, education and jobs. We urge the delegates from the European Union to hold the European Commission accountable on its promise to have a carbon-neutral continent by 2050, and that one of the new main pillars of its Eastern Partnership network will be a partnership that greens. Moldova's climate ambition is dependent on the ability of the EU to put its money where its mouth is. And finally, the youth of the Republic of Moldova urges Prime Minister Ion Chicu to deliver on his commitment to biodiversity resultant from his signature on the Global Pledge of Leaders for Biodiversity at the UN Summit in late September, and present a feasible plan of scaling the share of naturally protected areas up to 30% of our territory by 2030, as well as submit a strategy of getting to net zero by 2040 for public and parliamentary consultation. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates and observers of mock COP26. I speak to you from a cold and small country which we jokingly like to call our Faroe country, the Netherlands. 2 months ago, a team of young people and I hiked more than 500 kilometers across the country to bear witness to the impacts of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Even though we are a small country, we could see the drought in the east and the monoculture in the west. Luckily, more and more young people are demanding a future-proof country with more biodiversity and less greenhouse gas emissions. One such example is the We Are Tomorrow Global Partnership. This youth-led partnership creates an agenda for a common and sustainable future determined by youth ourselves. This agenda started in the Netherlands and has now reached South Africa, Chile, and many other countries. Youth are envisioning their own future. But of course, we can't do it ourselves. We need our leaders to take responsibility for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, the European Youth calls for climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. This means cutting European Union greenhouse gas emissions by at least 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires the adoption of consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and an effective implementation of the EU Green Deal. Thank you.
Greetings to all the delegates from all around the world and everybody who has the chance to watch, follow or participate in the events of mock COP26. We come to you today on this conference completely led by the youth for the whole world to talk about a small country in the Balkans, North Macedonia, with a population of only 2 million people. Our country experiences global warming in a way that our autumns and springs have shortened, as well as our summers are sweltering, and our winters have switched from their flawless touch of snow to air pollution. The capital, Skopje, being one of the most polluted cities in the last few years in the world, experiences something it has never experienced before, and part of it is due to the air pollution, meaning the unconserved behavior of the people. But most importantly, the official decision makers not pushing enough for tackling the issue. What should our country take into consideration more? Definitely focus on persistent education about global warming and its consequences from the earliest ages, since there are a lot of small alternatives that can be done that don't in any way reduce the quality of life, which is, as we know, probably one of the most significant values for a person. This includes teaching the children to use glass bottles instead of plastic bottles for only one use, using paper on both sides, buying local, cheaper food, especially fruits and vegetables, etc. Speaking of air pollution, it is unavoidable to talk about the massive percentage of greenhouse gas emissions present in our country and coming from the energy sector. In fact, as much as 70% of the emissions are from unjustly regulated energy and electricity production of fossil fuels as well as the transport system. This is also topped up by multiple other systematic injustices happening, such as number of marginalized communities living in no conditions at all and below the poverty line. Additionally, there is a huge percentage of unemployment rate, as much as 20%, and social inequality. This gives a multidimensional perspective to the problem of dealing with air pollution and climate change. After all, reality points out the question of how can we teach our children at school about the climate crisis and pollution if basic human rights and living conditions are not provided to everyone in the country. And we're talking about 20% of the whole people, of 2 million people. But that is also part of the issue. Therefore, we demand for our country radical transformational acts that will tackle the interlinked social and climate crisis from its root causes. And I would just finish this speech with a quote from the very famous Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Change is not only possible, but it is necessary. Thank you.
This year, young people were unable to protest on the streets. The whole world is dealing with the pandemic crisis. However, parties must still hear our voice. Even if you do not see mass protests, the youth is here, demanding action to save their future. With each day, we have less time to make a change and prevent the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. That is why we ask every country to create a clear climate action plan based on the best available science.
As we belong to the European Youth, we call for the EU to adopt climate objectives that are aligned with science and the Paris Agreement. That is, cutting our GHG emissions by 65% in 2030. This ambitious target requires to adopt consistent and coherent policies across all sectors and to effectively implement the Green Deal. Currently, the European Council is deciding on actions to be undertaken by the EU member states, and we are deeply worried by the Polish position in this discussion and the ignorant approach.
Reforms of energetics planned by the Polish government are insufficient.
In order to reach the goal of climate neutrality, Poland must stop using and mining coal before 2030 and invest in renewable energy sources. At the same time, politicians cannot forget about people working in industries responsible for emissions, like miners. The government must consider their needs and provide them with the necessary stability and security. Climate justice is social justice.
The key thing in fighting climate change is knowing its causes and consequences. In Poland, schools provide almost no climate or ecological education. This must change. We demand that Poland and all the other countries introduce mandatory ecological education at schools of all levels, that they allow regular dialogue, consultation and cooperation with all social groups, and that they reflect their planned efforts regarding action for climate empowerment in their NDCs.
We, the young generation, have plenty of energy, hope and ideas. We dream of these ideas blossoming in the future and saving our Mother Earth from a disaster.
But what if the future never comes?
It is time to finally stop fighting each other and instead start fighting climate change together.
We have already started leading the action. Will you join us?
We are delighted to speak today on behalf of the young generation of Romania, an Eastern European country that more than 90 million people call home. Romanian citizens have been no strangers to the adverse effects of global warming. They have endured floods and droughts and storms. Some of them call it the will of God, but the young people prefer to call it climate change.
Our carbon sinks are shrinking. They're disappearing at the hands of abusive and corrupted institutions. Our people are dying. In Romania, almost 20% of deaths are directly linked to pollution levels. That means 1 out of 5 people we know will probably die because of this, and yet they do not care. We demand the Romanian government to design a proper climate strategy that realistically addresses the national determined contribution, because so far their efforts are insufficient and inconsistent with the Paris Agreement. We push our national leaders to set a needed target of at least 37% share of renewable energy sources by 2030, as Romania has an incredible renewable energy potential. We demand concrete integrated phase-out policies for mono-industrial areas, effective economic mechanisms for managing the risks of stranded assets and social reprofilation. So far, Romania's national plan for investment and economic recovery is more than deficient and laggard. We also demand the introduction of domestic carbon price floor in order to incentivize a faster transition to a low-carbon economy. We request a quicker implementation of SUMAL 2.0, the Forest Inspector software, and other rigorous surveillance mechanisms for tracking, monitoring, and punishing illegal logging.
We call for an increase in strictly protected natural areas to up to 10% of the country's surface and a 30% share of Nature 2000 areas. Romania ranks 8th in Europe in terms of the number of deaths due to air pollution and with 5 infringement cases on air quality. Road traffic and improper infrastructure affects human health through emission of human respiratory system. The most affected groups are children and elderly. There are different methods of measuring air quality, but unfortunately, they are not used properly. We propose the reintroduction of the green stamp duty that was taken out in 2017 so that all cars pay more for emissions. It is mandatory to develop further the electric vehicle infrastructure in order to facilitate the transition from fossil fuel vehicles. We stand by our fellow European activists and we call for climate objectives aligned with science, namely adopting a target of 65% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030.
We demanded environmental justice, yet so far they only gave us corruption and malfeasance. And here we stand again demanding that national and global leaders save our future, or at least try to.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of COP26. It's an honor to speak to you on behalf of Serbian youth. Serbia is a small European country, rich in nature diversity, history, and culture. Serbia is a home to hundreds of different animal and plant species, together with a population of around 7 million people. Unfortunately, Serbia had already felt effects of climate changes. For the past few years, summers are getting hotter, rain is falling in times when we least need it, crops are reducing. The average year's temperature has risen by 1.5 degrees Celsius in the past 20 years. In 2007, we had extreme temperatures, with the highest temperature in Serbia ever measured, of 44.9 degrees Celsius. Again, in 2012, one of our biggest problems appeared, the drought. Drought has brought fires, destroyed crops and forests, and had a big impact on Serbia and its ecosystems. Science says the biggest impact on this extreme weather is industry. Then, in 2014, we had floods that affected 38 settlements, taken with 51 human lives, did many damages and polluted rivers. The cause of floods is temperature rise, which comes with bigger air humidity and more rain. The floods and drought are present today in less extreme measures, together with huge air pollution that affects health, wild landfills that pollute lands and underground waters, deforestation and species extinction caused by unlimited tree cutting and poachers. Luckily, not everyone are ignoring these problems. Many scientists, influencers, small organizations and other people done different things to raise awareness and help prevent climate changes. In 2019, Serbian activists had joined Fridays for Future movement and held protests ever since. People also gathered to protest air pollution and mini hydro. Last year, people started a project and planted more than 50,000 trees all over Serbia. People have awoken. Our government, not so much. They built a wind farm and added small contribution to preservation of the environment, but Serbian authorities still care more about money than nature. We need to recycle waste, clean our lands and rivers. Our leaders should make laws that will contribute to saving the environment and invest in sustainable industry. We are tired of waiting. Take action now.
Dear colleagues, observers and delegates of mock COP26, it is such a privilege and a great honor to address you at this flat conference. We are representing the people of Slovakia, a small landlocked country in the heart of Europe with a population of 5.5 million people. Slovakia is a country that isn't feeling the worst effects of climate change yet. We are experiencing extreme weather conditions such as floods and droughts, which are slowly causing increased respiratory diseases and the prevalence of bacterial infection in our population. We are privileged enough that we aren't seeing the worst effects of climate change yet, but we recognize the suffering of others. The youth of our nation has realized that in order to combat climate change, we need to take global action. Thousands of people were in the streets during the global strikes in September 2019. Hundreds of thousands signed a petition for climate for the future in September 2020, and there are even more individuals willing to mobilize. Slovakia should improve its target of GHG reductions to 65% in 2030 to align with science to stay below 1.5 Celsius in warming. Climate education is needed across all elementary, secondary and high schools to be immediately implemented into the curriculum. Strong partnerships from global to local levels and across all sectors are crucial on the way to decent conditions of living on this planet. As the youth of Slovakia, we recognize the efforts of the government to overcome extreme industrial changes. Our GHG emissions have diminished by approximately 40% since 1990. We, the youth of Slovakia, would kindly ask our government to be even more ambitious in setting climate goals and to become a front runner of innovation and technology in the renewable field. Climate change should be prioritized as it probably is the greatest challenge humanity will ever face. Take action. Thank you.
In between the Alps, Mediterranean, and the Pannonian Plain lies a green country, Slovenia. With the size of around half of Switzerland, it is home to approximately 2 million people. Despite our small numbers, we consume as if we have close to 3 Earths at our disposal, which comes at a price.
In the last 60 years, the climate in Slovenia has changed significantly. The average surface temperature has risen for 2 degrees Celsius, which affects the development of plants and the length of the growing season. We have less rainfall in the west of the country, and due to warmer winters, snow is becoming a thing of the past. We are also encountering droughts and floods, longer and stronger heat waves, and more hot days. And on top of all of that, climate change is also affecting our water supplies.
The main youth environmental movement in Slovenia is called Youth for Climate Justice. Organizing 2 large protests in Slovenia, we gathered more than 20,000 concerned citizens. We're also active in spreading awareness of the climate crisis by organizing lectures and hands-on events. We're constantly addressing Slovenian politics who refuse to hear us. It's like we're on mute.
We plan to use coal for another 20 years. To be aligned with science and the Paris Agreement, we should cut our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 65% by the year 2030. Instead, Slovenia proposes a 40% reduction, and they call this plan ambitious. Wake up! Act long-term and according to science.
Climate measures are mostly carried out on individuals and not on the industry, the main polluter. Implement taxes for polluters and subsidies for carbon-free solutions.
We demand that the governmental plans and policies are thoughtfully implemented and consistently evaluated. We propose the establishment of independent supervisory authority which evaluates, monitors, and estimates that the commitments set in governmental plans are actually met.
Nothing is more dangerous than ignorance. It is time we implement climate curriculums at all stages of education, public climate programs for all citizens, and demand mandatory climate exams for politicians. It is time we face the facts.
We demand just transition of carbon-intensive industrial regions towards low or carbon-free society, living responsibly towards nature. No one should be left behind.
Estimados delegados y delegadas de la COP26, España es el hogar de 46 millones de personas y alberga numerosos ecosistemas ricos en su biodiversidad, pero también es uno de los países a los que más le afectará la emergencia climática de todo el continente europeo.
Para finales de siglo, el 80% de nuestro territorio será considerado zona árida, y esto afectará sobre todo a las áreas rurales que se volverán inviables para la agricultura de la que dependen. Además, en zonas como el Mar Menor, la eutrofización causada por la entrada de nutrientes de la agricultura ya está teniendo consecuencias devastadoras. A la vez, la subida del nivel del mar sigue amenazando nuestras costas, desde parajes naturales como el delta del Ebro hasta ciudades enteras como Cádiz o Donostia.
Ha aumentado asimismo la frecuencia de fenómenos climáticos extremos. Cada año, miles de personas ven desfiguradas sus vidas por gotas frías como la borrasca Gloria, las olas de calor y los incendios.
Frente a estas desgracias, la juventud ha adoptado un papel muy valioso y activo, incitando a la sociedad y las instituciones a hacer frente a la crisis climática.
En primer lugar, España aboga por impulsar medidas que favorezcan la descarbonización y también agilizar una transición hacia las energías renovables. Esta transición no será posible sin unos cambios en los usos de la energía, para que todos sean más adecuados a los límites de la Tierra. Asimismo, la juventud de la Unión Europea pedimos medidas que estén en la línea con la ciencia y el Acuerdo de París. Esto es una reducción de al menos un 65% de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero antes de 2030.
La segunda línea de acción que plantea España es impulsar la educación ambiental desde primaria hasta los estudios superiores, para que todo el estudiantado conozca la crisis climática y disponga de las herramientas para defender el medio ambiente en sus futuras ocupaciones.
La tercera línea de acción es la democratización en la gestión de la crisis climática, tanto a nivel político, asegurando la participación de los ciudadanos en la toma de decisiones que les afecten, por ejemplo, mediante asambleas, como a nivel productivo, descentralizando la producción de energía. La democratización comprende igualmente la obligatoriedad de las administraciones a decir la verdad sobre la crisis climática.
La cuarta línea de acción es la necesidad de conseguir un modelo de agricultura sostenible, respetuoso con la biodiversidad y cercano a los pequeños agricultores. También se deben desincentivar los tratados de libre comercio, pues generan perjuicios ambientales y fomentan prácticas ilegítimas como el acaparamiento de tierras. Del mismo modo, y alineados con las delegaciones europeas, instamos a la retirada de la PAC actual e implementar medidas coherentes con el Green Deal.
La quinta y última línea de acción es la importancia de implementar justicia ambiental. Son fundamentales para ello la perspectiva interseccional y los principios de quien contamina paga y de responsabilidades comunes pero diferenciadas, haciendo ver que los mayores contribuidores a la crisis climática somos los países del norte global y por tanto tenemos una deuda ambiental con el resto del mundo.
Tenemos poco tiempo, pero aún hay margen para actuar.
Kära framtida världsledare. We want to first and foremost thank the staff of COP for making this possible. On behalf of Sweden, we are thankful for this opportunity to share with the world how we are and will be affected by the climate crisis. When you think about Sweden, what do you see? Forests, snow, wide lakes, cold weather, perhaps Greta Thunberg or all the other amazing climate activists. Well, Sweden is now changing each year and slowly losing its reputation. Our forests are burning. Many parts of Sweden haven't seen snow in a while, and we get more rain than before and warmer summers. Our lakes and nature in general are losing species and our drinking water is threatened. Not to mention how our native population, the Sami people, are still being neglected. We can already see the damaging effect climate change has on our water. Climate change and bad use of the lands around lakes has caused our water to be browner, and the lake's ecosystems are now deteriorating, leading to the use of too many perfluorinated chemicals, more than the EU's limit. This makes water consumption dangerous. The youth and other large communities in our country fight hard to push our politicians to act and follow the Paris Agreement, the biggest movements being Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. Without the youth, Sweden would be nowhere near where we are now in the climate debate, but we are far from done. Studies show that the indigenous people in Scandinavia, the Sami people, are more vulnerable to climate change. The Sami people do not cause damage to the climate as we do, yet they will be hit the worst with the effects of it. Politicians need to listen to them and change their behaviors and attitude towards the Sami people and other minorities. Sweden is said to be an example for other countries when it comes to climate action. We do not think it is right to glorify our country as if their words matched their actions. We do far from enough and need to implement new laws and plans. Dear future leaders, remember this. An error does not become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We can redirect this. Thank you.
Switzerland is a country located in the south-central part of Europe. It has a population of 8.57 million citizens and a territory of 41,288 square kilometers. There are 4 official languages, which are German, Italian, French, and Romansh. The elevation ranges from 193 meters above the sea level in the southern part of the country to 4,624 meters in the Alps. Switzerland is a country that has been very affected by the climate crisis. The retreat of the glaciers, the decrease of the days with snow in low and middle elevations, the rising temperatures in the summer and winter, and the increase of the extinction depth are just a few consequences that are happening in the present that we can name. If we don't take this issue with the seriousness that is needed, we might have to pay a high price. Local or regional extinctions are expected from species that can't adapt or that can't move. Every summer could be as warm and dry as the summer in 2003. The change of temperature might attract invasive species, which probably will outcompete the native ones. And due to higher temperatures, parasites will develop faster than before. Not to mention that animals will probably live 300 to 500 meters above their previous limit. If we take into consideration all those consequences that could occur, it becomes clear that we have to act quickly. Therefore, we believe that the Swiss and other governments of the world have to put the climate crisis as one of their top priorities. We also believe that the younger generations should receive an extensive education about this topic, since it will affect them in the future too. Every country in the world should stick to the Paris Agreement and reach net zero emissions as soon as possible. We believe that Switzerland should create more protected areas in key locations in order to protect the most vulnerable species. We also believe that the Swiss government should give more attention to young climate activists, since most of them are well informed, care about the topic, and can provide possible solutions. We encourage the governments of the world to work together in order to find a solution for this problem. This issue is affecting all of us. Let's work together and take action in order to prevent it from getting worse. Thank you.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of COP26. We speak to you today representing the youth of Turkey, a land connecting Europe and Asia continents with a population of 83 million people. I'm Atlas Sarifoğlu, a climate activist from Istanbul for the last 2 years.
And I'm Furkan Çelik. I'm 16. I've been climate activist for a year. Here in Turkey, we are already experiencing the effects of climate change as well as into crisis. Increased amount of plastic waste imported especially Europe has led increased levels of pollution in the Mediterranean 10% to begin up from Turkey.
We are also suffering more of droughts, floods and tornadoes in some regions, causing fatalities, loss of land, wildfire and change in the ecosystem. Turkish youth recognizes that the global action to combat the climate crisis has not been sufficient enough.
In 29 September, about 40,000 people marched all over the country, including students and many other youth day campaign, joined asking for the climate justice, education implementation on climate, ratification of the Paris Accords and declaration of climate emergency as well.
These numbers aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science. Though many scientists suggest these figures are too moderate, these are the ones that have been accepted through the IPCC. And please note that these figures are global and therefore do not say anything about the aspect of equity, which is absolutely essential to make the Paris Agreement work on a global scale.
Turkey, as one of the 7 countries which hasn't ratified it yet, needs to ratify the Paris Accord to be able to take realistic measures on the climate crisis and getting in line with the agreement.
Carbon taxing along with the European Green Council should be adopted but to reduce income inequality by distributing income from tax to citizen as basic citizenship income. And yet imported plastic garbage should be only imported if the material is used as industrial raw material in their circular economy.
We are demanding that our government take immediate action and address the areas mentioned above. We feel the consequences of your decisions today. As a country, it is your responsibility to take drastic action and have outlined some realistic and science-based actions that would greatly improve our nation.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of COP26. We speak to you today representing the youth of the country of Ukraine, the largest all-European country with a population of 42 million people.
Analysis of the survey by the Ukrainian Climate Network of Non-Governmental Organizations on the impact of climate change on health show that young people are becoming more ill, headache and fatigue due to heat, exacerbation of chronic diseases.
Ukraine is a friendly country, a country which demonstrates how people can change the world when they unite together in order to create a better future for the upcoming generations.
As promised in the previous conference, A country is now revising its nationally defined contribution. Now Ukraine must set a target for 2030 and show whether we will continue to depend on dirty and harmful fossil fuels, or whether we will focus on sustainable development.
Ukraine is faced by some difficult battles. It's the 7th year that we have been facing Russian armed aggression against my country, Crimea, and parts of Donbass are temporarily occupied. As a result, we had a drastic decline in social standards of people's life. This makes it even harder for citizens, and in fact for people all over the world, to realize and to see climate change as one of the main issues.
According to a sociological study about mining towns presented by the non-governmental organization Ecodia and the representation of Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Ukraine, the opinions and attitudes of residents of the regions of Ukraine coincide with basic principles of fair transformation. Rational development and maintenance of the various areas of the economy, including the production and repair of equipment for alternative energy, is the way to go. After the gradual closure of mines and thermal power plants in the regions, the condition of air and water resources will improve.
However, climate change is already visible, and we experience some negative effects of it here in Ukraine. Ukraine is among the highest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. Ukraine's high carbon dioxide emissions are related to its exorbitant energy intensity.
A truly far-sighted government decision would be to support sustainable urban development, public transit and micromobility, to develop railways and to encourage the import of electric cars rather than old cars with internal combustion engines.
According to figures released in early January by Ukraine's Central Geophysical Observatory, 2018 was the warmest year on record in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
In recent years, we have seen more and more weather anomalies, droughts, floods, heat waves, dust storms, snowless winters, temperature records.
Water supply is probably the most crucial aspect of climate change in Ukraine. Fresh water reserves are in decline and expected to grow even scarcer in the coming years as droughts become more frequent. In 2019, the country saw 25% less precipitation than average, while the incidence of droughts has nearly doubled in the last 20 years. At the same time, the absence of a seasonal snow cover in much of Ukraine possesses threats to winter crops.
The creation of the second nationally defined contribution is an opportunity to approve a course for low-carbon development of renewable energy sources, industry, transport, and agriculture of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Hello, distinguished delegates and observers of the mock COP26. We speak to you today representing the youth of the United Kingdom and its overseas territories. The UK is the world's 6th largest economy and the 5th highest all-time emitter of CO2. We have already made some progress in reducing our emissions, but it is necessary that we also take responsibility for those emissions that we have offshored. Our people are already seeing increased risk of flooding and droughts, and our overseas territories are facing challenges from hurricanes and rising sea levels.
Through organisations such as Youth Strike for Climate, British young people have demanded that the government takes action for climate and social justice. Hundreds of thousands of young people have joined in climate protests across the country, demanding systemic change, not just promises and targets.
We ask our leaders to address our historical responsibility and use our influence to help our friends in the global south, through bold policies such as the alleviation of development debts and strong climate financing commitments. Our politicians should also leverage the UK's technical expertise to develop green jobs, and support this through incorporating the climate crisis into all aspects of the educational curriculum.
The epoch shifts of COVID and Brexit must be used to boldly address the systemic inequalities, discrimination and racism in this country. Recovery funding must be made conditional on addressing these issues in alignment with the Paris Accord. We demand the reinforcement of Citizens' Assembly's legislative power. Our response must be intersectional and democratic, not siloed and technocratic.
We call for mandatory alignment with the Paris goals for the UK's large financial sector, the institution of new economic policy that helps rather than hinders the green and just transition, the end of export financing of fossil fuels projects overseas, and the creation of a new government body which has the financial power to make good on these promises at the scale required.
We hope our government seizes the opportunity to address the ecological and climate crises simultaneously, embracing the co-benefits this will bring in health and well-being. They must put people and biodiversity at the forefront of nature-based mitigation efforts, whilst remembering that this is no substitute for the rapid decarbonisation necessary across all sectors.
The youth of the UK know that political ambitions still do not align with what the science demands. The IPCC have described the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2, and it is not one that we're willing to accept. People are suffering and dying already. As a developed country, our responsibility is to take more action than those with fewer resources, to use our wealth and our power to take real leadership. We demand of our leaders, as co-hosts of next year's COP, that they adopt an NDC of at least 80%, and we hope that other countries will follow in being as ambitious as possible. Thank you.